This is Billy Wilder, and I think we have a most interesting show today. I'm visiting with Mrs. Earl Lewis, Miss Bessie Lewis, who is a farmer's wife from way back. Ms. Lewis is 102 years old. We're sitting in what I'm going to call Miss Bessie's comfort corner in her house. They have lived in this house for how many years, Ms. Lewis?
About 60
about 60 or more years, and they have been a typical farm family over the years. What we're going to do today, Ms. Lewis, is just talk about some of the things that you experienced as a farmer's wife that people don't know about today, because farming is entirely different from what it was 40, 50 years ago, and it has changed, but maybe not all for the good. You lived in this house, and how many children did you raise here?
Well, we have 10 children.
And they weren't all born here, but
they were not all born here.
But
Sorry.
They really were all in this house at one time, weren't they?
At one time.
Right. Tell me a little bit about, we had talked earlier about, you met Mr. Lewis, I believe in Middlesex.
Right.
And you were teaching?
In the Free Will Baptist Orphanage there outside of Middlesex.
He came from a pretty large family too, didn't he?
Well, there were only 16 children in that family.
And
14 of them grew to adulthood.
Right. One of your first experiences farming, you said, was a little bit scary because you were not raised as a farm girl. And tell us a little bit about that, if you will, when you first got married and y'all started farming.
Well, we moved from the town of Middlesex to the farm adjoining his father's on the outskirts of Middlesex. And we farmed with him that first year. I found myself chopping tobacco and cotton in old red clay. That was the hardest earth I'd ever seen in my life, I think, and the hardest work I ever did. But I stuck with it. I had to prove to my husband that I could be a farm wife. I don't know whether he had faith enough in me to think that I could, or that's the reason he decided he would marry me in spite of my upbringing. But at any rate, it was a real chore. And it took a lot of courage and a lot of backbone aching and so on so forth to make it.
And y'all farmed there for a while before you moved?
The first year of our marriage, most of the first year of our marriage, we were there at that place. Red clay hills, rocks all over the place. We made a beautiful crop of tobacco. It was high enough that it would hide a horse almost. And I had to learn to do all those things like suckering and breaking out tops and all that. And part of it was fun.
Probably the most fun was when the day was over.
But then there was the work at the house. That was always there. That was always waiting.
Right. Over the years, what were the main crops that you...
Tobacco and cotton. We didn't do so much cotton because cotton was sort of on the out right at that time in that area because everybody was going to tobacco. We always had big gardens. My husband planted a garden big enough for the whole community, and he would just let people come and pick and get what they wanted, carry it home, and we canned a lot and preserved the fruits and things like that kind of thing.
Right.
Big potato patches, big cabbage patches, big collard patches, picked beans by the bushels and all that kind of thing.
Farming has really changed over the years. Think back with me, if you will, to the kind of work that the people did on the farms in the summertime, and then we'll talk about the wintertime work a little bit. Summertime, of course, was pretty much raising the crops, but as you mentioned, there was a lot of hoe work, hand hoeing to do.
That's right, and I'd never done anything like that before. My mother had a garden in a little plot next to our place in Kenley, but it was hers. That was her own private place to go and get away from us kids, I think. but she enjoyed getting out there and doing it, and we let her do it because we didn't want to. It was fine for Mother to do it, so I had never really done anything like it. I had to learn, and it was hard work.
The wintertime work in farming was completely different from what it is now, and we're talking about the era before chainsaws, before a lot of mechanization. The era that I like to say is the manpower and the horse and mule power days. In the wintertime, what were the kind of chores that you remember that Mr. Lewis and the rest of the family did? You spent most of your time in the kitchen, I'm sure, trying to prepare for the children and their clothes and whatever.
Anyway, in the winter, of course, to begin with, in the fall, we were in the pack house in the strip room because we had the tobacco that we had raised in the summer had to be graded and prepared for market. And that took a long time. At that time, tobacco was graded in several grades, 5 or 6 grades, laid out on a bench and then tied up in bundles and then put on sticks and packed down and then picked up and carried to the markets. And so there was something going on with tobacco all the time. And my husband had a habit of saying that tobacco was a crop that it took 13 months a year to grow, because there was at least 1 month during the year that we worked at night on tobacco. For instance, tobacco could not be handled without it shattering all over the place if it were too dry. It had to be, I've forgotten the word that...
Put in order.
Yeah. We used to have to lay it out on the grass and let the moisture get on it so that it would soften the leaves, and we could pick them up and fold them and tie tobacco bundles with it. And that kept the stuff from shattering and losing our tobacco that way. Mm-hmm. So that was the night work a lot of times, getting ready for the next day's work. We also had a big pit under our strip room that we went into and had racks down there, and we'd hang the tobacco in the pit, and the moisture from the ground would permeate the tobacco and get it in order. That was my word. I couldn't think what it was. Get that in order so that we could handle it the next day.
There was a lot of work in the woods too.
A lot of work in the woods because we cured tobacco by fire, by wood fire, right. Not kerosene or gasoline or whatever else they do today. I don't know what they do today. I don't see it. But they had to go to the woods and cut wood. We also burned wood in the house, so there was a double job of cutting wood. There had to be enough wood cut for the barns and enough wood cut for the wood stove in the kitchen, for the big stove that sat in the living room too. So that was the kind of thing we had to do in the winter.
You know, most people don't really equate to what we are talking about when we say the old-fashioned wood pile. But if you really think about the amount of wood that it would take to heat this house, to cook all the food that you cooked in the wintertime, well, and the summertime as well, it took an awful lot of wood. Do you remember anything about sawing the wood?
Oh, you're sneaky. I told you a story the other day about being caught short one time when the snow came, and the men had been cutting wood for the barns, but had not gotten enough wood for the house, and we didn't have the wood at the house. So he and I took a cross-cut saw and went down to the barn and sawed wood, and we slipped back and forth on the ice and the snow there. I was at one end of the saw and he was at the other, cutting wood for this house.
That's right much of a job too.
Well, it was for me.
I can recall cutting trees down with a cross-cut saw, and you know, most of the people that'll be watching this show cut trees down and only know that trees are cut down with a chainsaw. But cutting big trees down with a cross-cut saw could be right much involved.
It could, and dangerous too.
Yes, it could very well be. But things have changed a lot. Let's talk a little bit about, if you would, the kind of animals that normally y'all had on the farm here?
We had mules. We raised some horses. We had one horse named Charlie. We had a fire one time. Lightning struck a barn, not here on this place, but another place we lived. Lightning struck a barn, and we had 3 or 4 horses in the barn. And when lightning struck that barn, my husband and the children and I had been working beside the barn. Actually, we were weeding a sweet potato patch where we were going to get slips for doing sweet potatoes, planting sweet potatoes. And we had come to the house in a hurry because this storm had come up. And when the lightning hit, my husband jumped and ran. He saw it strike the barn, and he went and opened the gate to the lot around the barn so the horses could get out, and then ran in and opened the stall gates for them, the stable gates for them to get out. We saved every one of the horses that way. And Charlie was one of them, right. And he was a stud.
Chickens you had, I'm sure. Milk cows.
The first thing we bought after we bought furniture was a cow, because my husband had been used to milk all his life. He did not know how to get along without milk, so he bought a cow. I never had anything to do with a cow in my life. I knew they had horns, I knew they mooed, I knew they gave milk, and I liked milk, but I didn't know what to do with it. But I soon learned. I had to churn. I had to learn to churn. You want to know how I churned?
How's that?
We had a big old crock jar, it was about that high, something like that, about that big around. It looks like the pottery that you make, for instance. It had a wooden top, and in the middle of the top there was a hole. There was what we called a dasher, a wooden dasher. It was a long handled doohickey that fit down in the bottom of the jug, of the jar. It had it was like a double cross, and that thing was jobbed up and down. What's my word there?
That's a good one.
and I had to sit there and do this until the cream all came to the top in little globs, which was the butter forming on the top of the milk. I had to learn how to take that butter off of the milk, how to wash it, how to work the milk and the water out of it, how to salt it, how to form it, and all that kind of stuff. And boy, did I get a kick out of it, because you know what I could do? When I was sitting there turning like that, I had a book in my hand, or a magazine. I could sit there and do that way.
That was a way to relax, wasn't it?
It was a relaxing way, and sometimes I didn't get a chance to read except when I was churning.
You ever sell any milk and butter?
Oh, a lot of milk and butter. Our milk and butter's been all the way to the West Coast.
How about that?
We've had friends who had friends or family who would come in, and and our friends had been getting milk and butter from us. And when their friends and family would come to visit, they'd say, "You be sure to get me some milk or butter," whatever they wanted, to carry home with them, and they'd carry it home with them, and all up in the New England states too.
Talking about milk and butter, I can imagine that over the years that you have cooked maybe 10 million biscuits or 20 million, who knows how many, but
million's a big number, but I did a big number of biscuits.
What was in a routine day when all the family was here? I know that one of the staples was biscuit for all farm families. Tell us about getting the flour and making the biscuits. Did you use a wooden tray to make the biscuits?
I had a big, long wooden tray that Earl's father had dug out of a piece of wood. He had shaped it. I didn't see him do it because he gave it to us when we were married. But it hung on the kitchen wall, and I used that to make the biscuits. We'd measure the flour. Sometimes we had our own flour. Sometimes we grew wheat. That was not a usual thing for us to make our own flour, but we did do it occasionally. but most of the time we bought what we call prepared flour that was already mixed with the leavening, and all we had to do was put the milk and the lard in it. And the lard was homemade. We'll talk about that, I guess, when we go to talking about hog killings. But we had our own lard, our own buttermilk, because I had churned.
Right.
And this kind of thing. We had a big old wood stove. I remember we started out with a small one. Eventually, we graduated to what we called a range. It was a big, tall, baby blue. That was the prettiest thing that ever sat in the kitchen when that went in my kitchen. And the oven was great big, and I had big pans like this that fitted that oven. And they must have held 3 or 4 dozen biscuits. And I'd do them 3 times a day.
Right. That stove, of course, had to start early in the morning, and I believe you told me that Mr. Lewis was the one that cranked it up and got the fire going.
He did. He'd get the fires going all over the house. I did not have to do that.
But you know, I can just imagine with the number of children that you had to get ready for school, that breakfast
and pack lunches too.
Right, and breakfast had to come fairly early.
Yeah,
so,
right.
When did your morning usually start?
4 or 5 o'clock. In the summer, it was nothing to get up at 3 o'clock and go take out a barn of tobacco and come to the house and cook breakfast for my family, and then they'd go to the fields or the barns or wherever, and I'd be left at the house to do what was necessary for the next meal. Sometimes I got out and I could find a space in there where I could get out and work in the garden or pick vegetables or do something, you know. Or even at the barn, I'd go to the barn and work until time to come in and do the lunch.
That was a period of time, too, that during tobacco barning time, you actually cooked for all the hands that were working, too.
I'd cook for 20 or 25 people a day.
That's a lot of food.
That's a lot of people.
It is. You know, one of the things that has changed a lot, many folks don't know what we're talking about when we talk about hog killing. They really think that pork comes from the grocery store.
Right.
Back then, it did not come from the grocery store.
Like they think that chocolate milk comes from cows.
Right. But talk to me just a little bit about your experiencing hog killing day.
Well, I didn't enjoy it, I'll tell you that. And my first one was a disaster almost. Earl's family raised a number of hogs because, as I said a while ago, there was a great big crowd of them too. And the neighbors came in and out. I mean, they swapped work. They came together at times like that and helped each other. It was a real cold day. The first year we were married, cold day in November, when I had my first experience with hog killing. Very, very cold. I thought I'd freeze to death that day. And we did not get through until way in the night. And it was a beautiful night. The moon last night and the night before made me think of that night. It was so bright and brilliant. And Earl's mother and I, my husband's mother and I, were left eventually to wash the chitlins. And that was something else. If you've ever been around a hog killing and got into that part of it, you know that it's not only messy, it's stinky, it's everything that's ugly.
Now, when you talk about hog killing, Ms. Lewis, one of the big things in years past in hog killings was the rendering of the lard.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of put in time frame how that went along. You killed hogs early in the morning. It was always on a cold day because it had to be
Right.
cold enough for the meat to chill.
You mean how did the lard business come to? How
Yes,
did
ma'am.
it evolve?
Right.
Okay. The ladies in the community found themselves taking the meat and trimming all the fat, taking the skins off of the shoulders and the hams and things like that, and then trimming off all the fat and cutting it up in little cubes, not little tiny pieces, but small enough that it didn't take it all day long to cook out, you know. We'd get all that done while the men were doing the rest of their stuff and salting the meat down and hanging it. When we got ready to render the lard, most of the time we did it in a big old black wash pot that we also boiled clothes in for laundering, which meant that the pot had to be scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed before you put any food in it, you know. So it was a double whammy. Double whammy, I guess. We put a little bit of fire under the pot, not much, because you would ruin your lard if you let it get away from you, and it could get away from you. It would bubble up and do this kind of thing. You put a little bit of fire under there, and you got coals, and you try to keep coals under it all day, as long as it took to cook it, instead of blaze. And you'd stand there. I had a paddle that was long like that. You couldn't stand close to it because of the fire and the stuff spattering on you. A great long paddle that I guess Earl's father had maybe whittled out for me, and it had a paddle like an oar at the bottom, and I held that thing and I stood there, stirred and stirred and stirred.
And this was how long a job?
But it would take hours. It would take hours at a time. And when the lard was done, all this meat came to the top of the pot, and you skimmed it off and put it out somewhere where it could spread out and dry, and that was cracklings.
Crackling. Tell us about what did you do with the cracklings?
We stored them. We made crackling bread, and crackling bread was made with cornmeal, a little bit of salt. I can't remember. I think we put a little bit of lard in it. I'm not sure. Maybe the cracklings gave it enough shortening. We baked it, and when it was brown and crusty, take it out and eat it just like it was. We ate it with vegetables. We ate it as is. We ate it with butter. It was good.
Did you ever eat it with molasses? That's one of my favorites on cornbread.
Probably because we had molasses in those days. I've not seen any molasses lately.
You also made a lot of preserves for
a lot of
sweets,
preserves. In the summer, we stayed busy doing preserves and jellies and jams and canning the vegetables, and in fruit season, we'd buy peaches because we didn't raise peaches. We'd buy peaches, and I would sit up at night, and they would come when Earl was doing what he called running a high heat at the barn.
Right.
And I would peel peaches and pack them in the jars, and he would come and take them to the barns and set them down on the ground in the barns where the high heat was being run, and they would be processed that way.
And this you're talking about a temperature in the barn that was around 180 to 200 degrees.
Whatever the high heat was, right. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but it was when they were curing out. I think. Mm-hmm. And we did tomatoes the same way. We did string beans that way, and I had a pressure cooker, for that matter, but that was a lot of trouble. And this was not quite as much trouble, because all I had to do was put them in the jars and get them down to the barn and back home. But it was easier than doing it the other way. Then I had the cold bath sort of a thing, a big pot full of water that you put the jars down in, the filled jars down in, and boiled them and boiled them and boiled them and cooked them that way.
Right.
That was all the way we canned.
Okay. Ms. Lewis, with typical farm families, and yours was a little bit more than typical because you had quite a few children, washing was a chore with a lot of clothes to wash. And back then, you didn't go to the store and buy Tide or Doers or whatever it was. What did you use to wash your clothes in?
There was a washing powder called the Gold Dust Twins. That was my washing powder. I grew up with that,
Right.
and so I used it in my own home when the time came. I washed on a washboard. Did it this way. I washed my knuckles to pieces many a time. It was a job. I don't know how long it was before we got our first washing machine. Earl's mother had a washing machine that she pulled it back and forth, a lever or something like that. But I didn't want that. But long about that time, I cannot remember now the name of the washing machine. It's one of the good ones today.
Maytag? Was it?
Maytag came on the market. There was an outlet over at Clayton. We found out about it. We went to see it and we bought us a Maytag. We never were without one until fairly recently, and well, maybe since my husband died.
Now that was after electricity was available to you.
Electricity was available a long time after we came over here. We used Aladdin lamps. Do you know what an
Yes.
Aladdin lamp is? With the mantle.
Mm-hmm.
And the mantles were so fragile that if you breathed on them, why, they'd come all to pieces, and you had to put on another one. That
Pretty
kind
bright
of
light compared to a kerosene lamp.
A white light. It was a white light. Yeah, right.
Lye soap was used for real dirty clothes, wasn't it?
It was used for not only for the dirty clothes, but for the dishwashing and the scrubbing of the floors and things like that. And the wood floors actually got scrubbed with a broom and a brush. The floors were not carpeted then. We had linoleum on floors, but they had to be washed too. But we didn't scrub them like we did a bare floor. I'm trying to think.
Tell us a little bit about making lye soap. You've made some lye soap, I know.
Okay, we go back to the rendering of the lard there. There was always some waste. There was waste in the house when we'd fry bacon or side meat. Not ham. We didn't have much ham drippings to go to waste because I made gravy out of them. But there were things like that, and I saved them during the year. You used lard that had gone rancid, or your drippings that were not any good any longer. Any meat scraps that you wanted to use in your soap, you kept them all together somewhere. I think it was 5 pounds of meat or grease
Right.
to a box of Red Devil lye.
Right. Can.
A can of Red Devil lye. And I can't remember how much water now, but we would make 3 or 4 boxes of soap at a time in a big black wash pot, that same wash pot that we used for rendering lard in and for boiling the clothes. And we'd boil that until it, I don't remember how we decided it was done. I think we probably did the drip method to see if it was going to congeal. But at any rate, when it was, you let it set probably overnight, and by the next morning it would be firm enough you could take a butcher knife and just go right down like this and cut out your great big hunks of soap and lift them out, put them out on the board in the sunshine and let them dry out. When they were dry, well, you stacked them in the smokehouse and brought them in when you got ready for them.
Right. You know, we were talking a few days ago about the house and fire and so forth, and you did have a fire in this house years back, and I'm sure that was a scary time.
It was a very scary time. It was a very lucky time very lucky that I acted as I did that time. We had a small baby who was asleep in the living room in a cradle, real cold winter night, and I had gotten supper ready. We had supper then instead of dinner. Farm people never had dinner. They always had supper. And I had gotten the family down here for their supper. And I got up from the table to go see if the baby was all right. I had moved her as close to the fire as I dared to when I left to come to serve the supper. And when I got back in the house, the mantle was blazing. The fire had dropped out of the fireplace. We were using fireplaces in all over, and dropped out of the fireplace and it rested against the mantle, and it caught it at the floor and was just going right up like that. And I yelled for my husband, and he came running. At that time, we had a porch that went all the way down to that door, and a bench, a shelf built to hold the water buckets and the wash pans and so on that we use bringing water from the well down at the bottom of the yard. And there were buckets of water up there, and he grabbed something and went running and dashed it on the fire and put it out. So we didn't have to call the fire department.
Well,
We didn't have one.
I was gonna say, you could have called a long time, perhaps.
We didn't have one.
Right. Let's talk just a little bit about, I know farm families years ago often moved from one farm to the other, and that was a little bit of a chore, wasn't it?
It was more than a little bit of a chore. Incidentally, my daughter Frances has written a book about that. She had a brother-in-law, my son-in-law, who asked her one day, "Why did you all move so often?" He didn't understand what was taking place. So she decided that she also had brothers and sisters who didn't know what it meant, because we had bought the farm and were staying put when the younger children came along, and they didn't go through that business of moving every year like she had done. She was the oldest. So she wrote this book. We, in spite of the fact that we had a stigma against us because we were tenant farmers, we still had ambitions. We wanted to do the best we could for our children, for ourselves. We wanted to better ourselves. And so each year we looked to see where's the next place to go that will do better than we've done here, wherever we happen to be. And if we found something that suited us and we could get it, we moved to it. If that meant another move the next year, we did that, but we felt like we were moving upwards instead of getting in a rut and getting in worse shape all the time.
And a move meant what?
Everything. Not only your household furniture and everything in it, but everything on the outside as well. We moved to Pamlico County one year and carried our chickens, our hogs, our cows. Went down there, we had not farmed like they had farmed down there. We lost our shirts down there. Our shirt.
One shirt.
One shirt. Because they raised different kind of crops from what we had raised. And my husband didn't quite understand it. And
the moving chickens and cows and all your plows and all that stuff had to be a real experience.
it was. It really was awful. It was not something to look forward to.
But y'all have been in this location a long time.
We came in the 40s.
And we're now on Old Lewis Farm Road, which is in Wake County. And your family was basically all were raised here.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I would like to have you comment on, with all of the things that you had to do, and with all the cooking and all the canning and with all the other things, you always managed to get your children to church. And you might comment on that.
So what?
Well, a lot of people didn't.
Well, maybe being the daughter of a minister had something to do with it. I was brought up in church, although not in the Free Will Baptist Church as much as I was in the Missionary Baptist and the Methodist churches, because there was not always a Free Will Baptist Church close to us. There were no cars then. My dad got one of the first cars in Morehead City, but he wasn't always there to drive it, because he was somewhere else. It was like the shoemaker's children going barefoot. My dad was off taking care of somebody else's children in church and Sunday school, and his kids were having to get there any way they could. We laughed about it, and we teased him about it a whole lot. That was the way it was. My husband was a missionary Baptist, member of the church that we lived close to that first year. We were on the farm, and he was accustomed to going. Somehow or other, we just went. We were not regular in attendance when we were on the farm. I got pregnant 2 months after I got married, and I didn't feel like going always, and I guess I used that as an excuse to not go, but we were fairly regular.
In Nightdale, though, when you had transportation, you were always, you and your family,
my
always there.
husband got the children there. He was one in a million, I guess, because a lot of men would not have taken the responsibility of a carload of children going to church with him like he did. And I was at home with the baby or doing whatever I had to do. I was not faithful at all to begin with, because it was easier for me to stay home, I guess. Or maybe I felt like it was better for me to stay home and keep home fires burning. That was the example my mother set for me. My mother was not a strong supporter, that doesn't sound good to say it that way, of Daddy's work. In other words, she didn't go with him because she was busy taking care of us children. There were 7 of us, and she stayed home. And I guess I felt like that was my role too for a while. But finally I got tired of not being a part of it. And Nightdale Baptist had a revival, and Mr. Huggins was preaching the revival sermons, and I went and he preached to me one night. And he told me, there in front of all the people in Nightdale, although he didn't call my name, but he was talking directly to me, "You're just like a limb on a tree, a rotten limb on a tree. You're just hanging there, but you're not doing any good." And he said, "Your membership is back yonder somewhere. You're not supporting that. You're not supporting this church. Why don't you do something about it?" Well, it stirred me, and I went to my dad. And I said, and my reason for not having done that before was because I didn't want to hurt him by pulling out of his denomination that I had been brought up into and going into another one. And I told him about it. I said, "Mr. Huggins said I was not any good anywhere." He said, "Son," he called all of his children son, girls and boys alike. He said, "Son," he was right. He said, "Go with Earl." And I went with Earl, and I was with Earl as long as Earl lived.
Right. Ms. Lewis, I'm sure that there's a lot of things, I know that there's a lot of things that have changed. What, over the years, probably has been among the most surprising things that you have experienced and seen? You now have television, you have electric lights, you've got centralized heat. A lot of things have changed over the years. What are the things that maybe you most appreciated and most have been surprised at?
Where I had my sister in Goldsboro, I had 2 boys who were brought up on comic books, and when they finished with them, she brought them to my children, and I didn't want my children to have them. They were the most far out things I ever saw or heard in my life. It was all this airspace, all this stuff that has come to pass. I thought, it could never be. It will never be. I don't want my children brought up on this mess. That was the way I felt about it. And so I wouldn't let them have the comic books. And I think, now that it's come to pass, that I was very foolish. I can see that, but there's so much, and I'm being facetious here, I like nylon stockings.
Ms. Lewis, it's certainly been a pleasure visiting with you today. I recognize that you probably have as much experience as a farm wife as anybody because of the number of years that you have been on this farm and just the number of years that you've been here on this earth. And I thank you for the opportunity to visit, to shed a little light on how farming used to be, how a farmer's wife had chores that are a little different from what they are today. Thanks again for visiting with me. This has been A Wilder Sing. We'll see you next time.